like they
Three,
do in
2, 1, go.
like a like they do in
Hey,
Anchorman. Can you
hey,
not do
we're
that?
live, Terry. Hey, Terry, we're live.
Oh, are we live?
Hey, Terry, 3, 2, 1, we're live.
All right, welcome to today's Do the Work video. As you can tell, things are highly professional today, and good to see everybody. And look forward to our discussion where we're going to talk about, of all things, using wisdom in the work, which may be ironic considering how things opened up for us. Phil, good to see you today. How you doing?
Yeah, I'm doing all right. It's Tuesday. That means I have either remembrances of tacos or dreams of tacos because that's what you do on Tuesday. But it's also a bonus to sit down and talk about the work of an evangelist with you today. And maybe by the pooling together of our two functioning brain cells, we can actually generate a spark of wisdom to some degree or another.
Yeah, tacos has been a theme of the day for all of us so far this morning, and it's kind of interesting. And I don't know how I'm going to fulfill the crave that now Phil has put into me, but let's move on from tacos and talk about wisdom. And somewhat of a more generic introduction, Phil, to probably some discussions we'll have at another time where we talk about some specific instances of using wisdom. But we want to kind of get into just the idea of using wisdom, and especially in regards to preaching. Obviously, wisdom's needed in personal interaction, in building rapport with the members, how you handle difficult questions in a Bible class. But that's a different topic than what we're really looking at today. We're looking at the idea of selecting your message and maybe even messages. And we will kind of get into that idea of, hey, this kind of thing may be better off in a Bible class than a sermon. But as we begin, we're going to talk about the idea of knowing what to say. What am I going to preach on this week? How do I select that? And then maybe even more specifically, once that's determined, which I think that's the easier part, even within the context of that sermon, how do I know what to say about that specific topic? So as we introduce that, I will tell you that I'm a planner. I did not used to be a planner. I used to be one of those guys that waited till Tuesday or Wednesday in order to pick my topics for Sunday. I no longer do that. I actually began planning several years ago on a quarterly basis. And now, since it happens to be that I preach one lesson a week, I actually plan pretty much annually at this point, where I have an annual idea, and that is largely predicated on series, by the way. I think I mentioned before that I do series as far as they go once a month. So, for instance, the first Sunday of every month, we're talking about prayer. The second Sunday of every month, we're talking about the home. The third Sunday of every month, we're looking at Calvary. And so it does a couple of things. First off, I'm not here in this kind of analysis paralysis mode on Thursday going, what am I going to talk about? I don't encounter preacher block for the most part. And that is a very comforting thing because we jokingly talked about that in our prep session. But it also allows my members to know it's coming up, and they appreciate that in where I'm at now. They think that's a great thing. So there's some marketing advantages to that as well. So from an initial standpoint, that's how I handle choosing. Now, I have flex positions. The fourth and fifth Sundays are somewhat flexible. If I have something kind of a current thing I need to talk about, I can do that without any hesitation or problem. So I've allowed myself some openings throughout the year to be able to make sure that I'm not so locked in that if we have a tremendous issue that we've got to deal with, that I go, I can't preach that. Obviously, that's not how that's handled. So that's kind of an introduction to how my process begins. Phil, I think you're not that far different on some of that.
Well, my way to get there might have been a little stranger journey in some ways. Like Terry, especially when I first started preaching, it was, what am I going to preach this week? That was basically the paranoia of the young preacher is I'm afraid, I'm nervous. And so I solved it initially by coming to the building with two sermons ready to go every single Sunday for about the first 11 years of my preaching, like fully fleshed out. Everything's ready, and they fit two gaps. One of them was more focused towards the home crowd. They were very much identified. And this was Sunday morning, Sunday evening, by the way. And sometimes that meant on some Sundays I had 4 sermons ready to go. But the home crowd would be an encouraging one, maybe a specific doctrinal one, something like that. It never themed it together, especially maybe the first 5 years of my preaching. Themes were uncommon as a general trend until I made a switch. Secondly, the other sermon was more outreach focused. It would be if we would, for whatever reason, have a larger group of first-time visitors, or maybe someone had asked a Bible question. And so I had the sermon ready to answer their question, and they wanted me to preach on something, but maybe they were visitors, maybe they're elderly and they weren't there every single Sunday. And so I was always keeping that as my back pocket second sermon. And so I would get up to preach. I'd have both charts ready to go on the laptop and both outlines laid out for me there. And I would look in the audience, and then that would solve my anxiety of making sure I had covered all my bases, and I would preach. I will tell you that the output probably wasn't as good as it could have been, because you're carrying 4 ideas in your head to the pulpit versus 2 or 1. And that's a stressful thing.
That's insanity, by the way. I just have to say that I admire your preparation, but that's insanity.
There's problems with that model. Now,
Yeah.
we'll get into those in a little bit. So I began to solve it by doing something really important. I think is powerful for young preachers. I started preaching expository series. And so if I look at my preacher notes, you can find out, hey, this is when he started doing long, broken down expository series. And since I'm going to preach through the minor prophets, or I'm going to preach through the Psalms, and I'm going to break the text down in small chunks appropriate for the time length of a sermon. And you know that on Sunday nights, he's going to be in the minor prophets, and that's what we're going to be doing. I did that because it fit well into the congregational teaching program of what else was going on in the Bible classes, primarily for adults. That helped me learn those texts. That shifted the anxiety of my preaching to a different area. And sometimes I would still come to the pulpit with that backup sermon because someone asked about a specific thing. But it became much less likely that I would do that. Here's the great advantage to that part of that is that you do not end up having a reactionary preaching model, which is where some of those things can lead to if you don't manage it better. And so that's part of, like, when you figure out what to say, if you build yourself a plan, then you now know what to say. And I plan yearly now too. Our congregational context for our sermons gives me personally less than 50 sermons a year because of gospel meetings and my travels, my own meetings and other meetings, all those stuff mixed together. I'm doing less than 50 of those sermons every year at Eastside because we only have one primary sermon time. So with that shift means more value needs to be applied to each of those sermons, and sermons are different than classes.
Right.
And I do some four-pack sermons, which is basically like your monthly sermon set, so where all 4 sermons of the primary 4 weeks are the same. And then the 5th sermon might be my variable option. Okay, what's not being caught elsewhere? And so that will come in. But for this year, at least, I did something different where we wove themes together. We had a congregational theme that applied to 2 preaching themes. And the congregational theme is from Ecclesiastes. It's being knit together as a threefold cord. And so that's the congregational theme. And so you're probably going to get 1 sermon a month that matches that theme. Underlying that, I had 2 additional themes that I worked together in regards to Jesus and his parables, and then Jesus as the Son of God. And so it may not all be ultra obvious, which gets to another thing that I think is really an interesting way that you can approach an expository sermon series, if we want to talk about that too in a second. But I moved from chaos, 4 sermons, to absolute structure sequentially, to a much more tapestry-driven, woven into the teaching program of the congregation structure, because there's some natural great reasons why I thought that was necessary. And that helps me figure out, all right, what am I going to say? Because if the text drives our conversation, the text will tell me what I need to say. It won't be
Yeah.
me figuring out how do people feel, how do I feel, what do we need to make, all that kind of low end, low order structural stuff.
It also requires you when you preach the text to say things that maybe otherwise you would like to skip over. It doesn't just keep you from only focusing on one area. It forces you to focus on other areas as well. And back when we had two sermons where I was at before, now like you, we basically have one primary slot. Back when we had two, I would also do the expository thing where essentially on the second Sunday of every month at the secondary lesson, which for us was the first lesson in a 3-hour block, I would preach one chapter at a time through a text. And so like one year we worked through Galatians and then Ephesians. And so we did the same things, and it was really good because it forces you to deal with the entire text, and it forces you to teach something that maybe otherwise you wouldn't. And it's a good cure for the just continuous topical preaching that sometimes is a problem.
Right.
So
and let me insert this about that continual topical problem. Topical preaching is valuable, but it's also hard. Most of the preaching in the New Testament is a smattering of textual topical mixes. But to do so effectively means you better be an inspired teacher, a master teacher, or judicial with your use of it. Very careful.
I think it's
if
interesting.
All your preaching is topical, it's a trouble.
I always laugh at the guy who talks about how you need to have textual teaching, and that's why he's going through the Sermon on the Mount. And I laugh because it's really just a huge conglomerate of topics thrown together. It's not like Jesus started with Exodus chapter 20 and did a exegetical kind of discourse on the law of Moses. That's not what he did at all. Or another one is 1 Corinthians. I'm going to do it. You just preach the text, go through 1 Corinthians. That's great. 1 Corinthians is actually just a letter in response to a whole bucket of topics that was thrown into Paul's lap. So, and I'm not saying not to do that textual saying. I'm just saying let's be careful about our kind of snobbery. We look down on the topical sermon sometimes because the things that you're doing textually are really just topical sermons. So we kind of talked about what to say. We probably need to move on to when to say it, and this is an important thing. Let me say this. There's some things. I think this is more of our idea. There's some things that are more appropriate about to handle in a Bible class than in the pulpit, and there's some things that are appropriate to handle more privately than either of those two options. And if you're a preacher who has two sermon spots on a Sunday, I don't, Phil doesn't. But if you are one of those, there are some things that are more appropriate to handle at what I would call that secondary time slot, which is the lower number and generally does not have as many guests.
Where's Chris Emerson? Did you call Chris Emerson? He wants his home bros.
Yeah. There's a home bro sermon and there's a no home bro sermon, or is that no hombres? I don't know how they do that in Texas. And so knowing where to time slot all of that, and let me say this, on the when, and we'll get to how, if you do textual, you're going to come into some things that you're going to have to address, but you need to address differently in the pulpit than you do privately or even in a Bible class. So all of that is important to kind of use wisdom in those regards. So for instance, when you think about when to say something, there's some things you don't need to probably discuss in a room full of kids that you could discuss in a room full of adults. There's some things you don't discuss in a room full of co-ed adults that you would in a room full of male adults.
Right.
And I think,
or your wife might address equally in a.
What's that?
Yeah. Well, or that your wife or an older lady might address in a different. Like those are pretty easy things, and I'll go ahead and open part of our future conversation table here and at least give some illustrations too about what Terry's talking about. The subjects of human sexuality, sexual relations are things that need to be taught about. They need at times to be preached about, but determining what, when, and where is part of the first steps of figuring out, okay, now what? Because I know we need to. based on, studies, conversations, spiritual encouragement and discussion with Christians who are struggling in various ways. In many places, it hasn't been done well. I mean, just, straight, plain talk. And so that means it needs to be better. It doesn't mean that then you open up Song of Solomon and start dropping all the spicy details of the allegories and illustrations that maybe you don't understand because you don't understand ancient Near East culture, and that some of these metaphors are truly hyper intimate in the text of Song of Solomon, or even in the Old Testament. Aspects of the way in which people die often includes allusions to their character and nature in an intimate, more marital context terminology than you initially see in the text.
And so let me say this. Well, let me add to that, Phil. And we talked about this some in the past week or so. There is a danger with being too cautious at times in this area, and I think that's why wisdom's important. I do think there's some places where that we've removed the human sexuality discussions completely from the pulpit, and we've raised a generation of ignorant young people in regards to what God expects of them in this area. And so you got to find the right balance and use the right wisdom. You can't just say, I'm never going to talk about sex from the pulpit. Although I've been told before that's what our approach should be. And that's not the right approach either.
Right. Well, and here's the reason why we talked about structurally on the introduction side, and generally speaking, the value of serial preaching, the value of expository preaching, the value of planning your preaching. It allows you the opportunity to force yourself to preach equally about matters that matter to God. And this was part of the illustrative process that I think is kind of neat to catch in the text here. If you just roughly survey the kind of spiritual struggles that God deals with in the Old Testament and New Testament, you will find a fairly equal dispersion of all the types, whether it's improper relationships within a realm, like improper marital relationships, adultery, divorce, pain, anger, bad relationships. He deals with those. If you go to improper relationships of the sexual kind outside of marriage, he deals with all of those in the scriptures. Fornication, adultery from the other side, from the unmarried person participation in it. Homosexual, same-sex attraction. He deals with that too in the scriptures. But we don't deal with those because we're more comfortable with dealing with the things that are almost criminal in nature. Like if the law says don't do it in the land in which you live, well, then I can preach against that. And no one will be bothered or offended because everyone knows that's wrong. Well, then we don't preach about the other things. That's a reason why figuring out when do we say that becomes important. And one more thing to add to this, and this is something that goes through my thought process when I'm figuring out not only what I'm going to preach, but when I'm going to preach/teach it, is that there's a trickle-down effect of your audience. If I'm teaching adults, I expect them to do one of two things. First thing is to proactively teach their children, but also to model behavior for their children. And that's kind of the goal. Now, is it perfect in its application? No, but that's what I'm thinking through. So if I've got a bunch of adults, I'm teaching them what I want their kids to know eventually, either in behavior or in conversation. That kind of goes in some of this more stressful whys. And we will probably, Terry and I have talked about opening up those subjects in more detail and trying to figure out a good course of action to study it better so that those who preach, like Terry and I, and others who might be listening or participating, can do that better for the next generation.
Yeah, and a lot of this, we've not talked about this, but a lot of this in the area of when to say it depends on your congregation's kind of culture of what is, you can use the term appropriate or acceptable or effective. I think in this discussion, those are pretty synonymous. Every congregation is different. My last work was a very much of a more formal suit and tie kind of Sunday morning kind of place, more traditional in that aspect. And that was reflective of how they viewed the preacher. Now, I didn't always live up to that, by the way, as far as being that more formal kind of guy. It's just not really my style. Where I'm at now, if you came in and there's 150 people here Sunday, you might have seen 5 suits in the building total. The rest of the people are far more relaxed. We got a lot of guys that are just in their Sunday best jeans and their best boots and button-up shirt, and they have a more relaxed, I don't think casual is the best word, but more relaxed approach. And that's reflective in the culture here, that there's some things that I could say in a way publicly that would not be viewed the same way. It would not be viewed as negatively in that way if my previous work, which is a more formal, traditional kind of mindset. And this is where the word wisdom comes into play, and this is the best way I could do it, maybe Phil can expound. And this kind of gets into how to say it as well. The when and the how plays a role in this. You need to have the wisdom to understand your congregation enough to know when you can discuss a certain topic and then how to discuss it in that setting. And only you can really make that determination. I think what is really key in all that is you have to know the congregation you're at to have that kind of wisdom. And the best way to do that is to really get to know people. That goes back to relationship talks we've talked about earlier. The more you get to know people, the more you understand how they think and how they address certain issues and what they feel is acceptable and not acceptable and what is effective and not effective. So what that really means is there's a burden on your part to have that to build that knowledge base and to always be building that knowledge base in that sense.
Yeah. And it's not challenging in the sense there's some things that are hard to do because they're intellectually challenging. They are multiple issues at the same time challenging kind of stuff. This one's really not that. If you simply start with, if you have elders, go and ask the elders what has been taught on these subjects in the past. If they've been there for a while, they probably know if it's even been discussed before. You can also say ahead of time, hey, I think maybe in 2 months from now, I'm going to be preaching on social drinking and alcohol. Has that been talked about before here? How did that go over? What context was it? It's a 5-minute conversation that can save you 5 months of pain. If there's no elders, you can have that conversation with members who have been there a long time. And you may not like the answers you get and still decide to do something else. And wisdom sometimes comes in there because you realize, hey, no, we've got a problem with this. It hasn't been taught about before. My challenge then is to do a better job than was done in the past so we have a better outcome for the future. And that's all preachers are doing that every time they get to preach. They're trying to leverage past failures into future successes. And that goes into part of this discussion as well.
And in that specific instance, let's take social drinking kind of as just an example that's kind of somewhat easier than maybe talking about some of the more graphic things. You may find out it's never been talked about. You may find out there's some issues that there would be some discussion. And, I think some guys would go, well, if it's never been talked about, I need to preach about this. I got to tell you, in that kind of context, I think if you do that, you're very close to weaponizing your pulpit without realizing it. That probably means that's a better discussion to be used in a Bible class or even a small group setting than to get up and preach a very one-sided discussion about that.
Right. Because, like Terry's saying, you got to let some feedback come in. There might be a really legitimate reason why it's never been preached about, and you learn that the practice of the congregation is biblical in its application because preaching wouldn't accomplish that same goal per se. And it may again weaponize the pulpit. I think that's probably a good term for when we get on our hobby horses and call everyone to ride because the British are coming.
Right. Yeah. So we have a few minutes left to talk about how to say it, and that's kind of what we're getting into here as well. I tell you, I have a story one time I thought about in regards to this that I was going to preach about homosexuality. What I was specifically preaching about, by the way, I'd taken a couple months to plan this sermon. There was a fear, full disclosure, that could be an issue of influence in some lives of some individuals, and I was asked to preach on it. And by the way, that idea of influence could be a lot of different ways. I'm not going to go any deeper than that. It could be just the acceptance defense of it. It could be the practice of it. It doesn't matter. Just that they were being influenced. So I took a long time in this area, what to say and how to say it. For those who don't know, I completely write out my outlines. I think we talked about that before. They're in outline format, not manuscript format, but I write out everything I'm going to say, and this was especially a time where that was helpful. I also happen to have several brothers in my life. They are brothers who have practiced homosexuality and have repented and are faithful. And I talked to a couple of them about how to handle this, and I sent that entire outline to a couple of them. And so it took months for me to figure all of that out. So I'd put a lot of effort, and it had been announced that I'd talk about it. Well, there was a family that chose not to come because of their young children, because of what they were afraid I might say. And I understand that. I also understand that, first off, that was a wake-up call for me to make sure that, again, use a lot of caution in this area of how to say something. But nothing I said was in a way that was disrespectful or could have caused a lot of problems, I don't think. I was not upset with that family, by the way, and still not upset with that family. I understand. But when you do those kind of sermons that are edgy, and could cause some people to be troubled, you need to make sure that you're very careful in how you say things and what you say. You need to use more formal language. You need to cause as few problems as possible. I am by no means saying you don't preach on those kind of issues, especially when there's a concern. I think you do. But be very careful in how you say something. I'm a guy that seems to joke around a lot. There was nothing funny in that sermon because it's not appropriate. Yeah. And so from that standpoint, that gets kind of into what we're saying here. Be very hyper vigilant in those sensitive areas. To use the correct terminology, more biblical terminology. And, right. Rather than getting up and saying, gay people are just wrong from the pulpit, which is offensive. Right. You just read the passage and you let the Bible speak.
The passage will do a lot of those things. And terminology-wise, I remember talking to Steve and Betty Wolfgang a couple of times. They've spoken on some of these related subjects in public formats for years. And they always encourage a mixture of medical accurate terminology with biblical accurate terminology in order to alleviate confusion. Because then, look, this is what it says here in the scriptures, the same Bible you tuck your kid in with every night. And I'll use this illustration. This is probably a great way to think about why we need to talk about these things. In talking with a young Christian recently, listening to some music, and I asked, hey, do you know what this lyric means? Like, do you understand what they're talking about? And the answer was no. I don't. It just sounds cool. Like, I don't understand any of that. I said, okay, great. Let me just open your mind a little bit and tell you that this particular music is all about sexual conquest. Like, every single metaphor and idiom in there is about a man seeking to successfully bed a woman outside of marriage, outside of a holy relationship. And it's glorified and exemplified in that song. And so here's the issue. On the one hand, innocence is awesome. But on the other hand, influence matters. And eventually there's the potential for the intersection of that person's influence through the enjoyment of that song to reach out and destroy their heart. And so educationally, you talk to them privately about it. And say, hey, look, this is what's going on. I know who you are. I know who you want to be. But you need to know this now, too. Like, this is something you didn't know, and you're probably needing to know it now because you're going to interact with more people now in your life that are going to see that differently. But in all of that, so you still come back with, all right, when do I say that? Is that a pulpit conversation? No, it's not a pulpit conversation. And certainly not one that you would do as a pulpit conversation and include the person by name. That's destructive and damaging to everybody. But later down the road, it may be something in a sermon you make an allusion to, or in our case, it'll probably come up in a Bible class, but I won't be the one teaching it. Actually, that teaching is probably going to be done with one of our other elders.
So in those areas, let me say this, because you bring up the song. and this is a more practical application of the how-to. You're talking about not mentioning people's names and those kind of things. Another issue with that is, you may reference something from pop culture and you may not think, especially if you're a younger guy, you may not think anything of it. And somebody else puts that in an entirely different context. I remember one time mentioning a movie from the pulpit, and somebody took me aside later and was like, "Do you realize that movie's rated R?" And they had a real problem with that. You just have to be careful about that. Now, there's a context where somebody got upset with me one time. I was talking about taking my wife to dinner. We walked through a casino floor. My illustration was about how Satan works with sin and the temptation to want to gamble and how that works and none of that conversation was encouraging gambling, but somebody thought because I said it was because I took my wife to eat at a hotel that had a casino in it, which is what technically it was. But I was telling everybody it was okay to go to the casino and gamble, which was completely opposite from what the story was saying.
Right.
And so sometimes somebody may what I mean by that is don't always just change because somebody gets upset, but do when somebody talks to you, think about it, and don't buy trouble for yourself.
Right.
For instance, in the movie, you don't have to mention the movie title. Hey, I watched this movie and this happened. And it can be generic enough nobody knows. And I got to tell you, for pop culture references at this point in my life, that's generally how I handle those kind of things. Very generic so that nobody can go, wait a minute, you listened to that song or you watched that movie, or very generic so that you don't have to deal with any of those issues.
Because again, the goal is to use these concepts in the sermon, in the Bible class, in the private conversation to leverage spirituality forward. And so you're trying to pick the appropriate lever to create the equal amount of necessary change. Because you can kind of picture it as a rock on a ledge. You're trying to get someone to go out far enough that they get a bridge to the next pillar, but you don't push them so far that they topple over. And the feeling of being uncomfortable in those contexts is like, I'm going to fall, I'm going to fall, I'm going to fall. There's nothing to grab me. If you lever too strong, too hard, too demanding, too pushy, too soon, in the end, what you end up with is someone who just falls, and you don't get your outcome, which is teaching them to grow and to strengthen their faith. And that's kind of why we're talking about these three things, is these are really, really important to master earlier in your process than later if you can. The sooner you get a better appreciation of when to say things, where to say things, how to say things, now you're going to be able to accomplish so much more in your preaching. And frankly, you'll be better than Terry and I were early on. The earlier you get there, the earlier you guys will be there, and your work will be much better than ours. And that's one of our goals with this project, is to make young guys able to do much more than we could ever do.
Yeah, if you're not careful, the reason it's important is I've had somebody tell me before, when you said that, I completely lost concentration. I didn't hear anything else you said. Yeah. So the reason why this is so important is we haven't had a lot of participation and like other subjects, because this seems to be pretty generic, I think, and it's something that's pretty okay. We all try to do that, but it's an important part of the work, because you can be rendered completely ineffective in your preaching if you don't learn how to master these three things. And you could actually turn your preaching into a destructive thing, because it can not only be ineffective, but it can be destructive in what it does. And so we hope that just this would encourage you to think about these things. And even if you're a guy like Phil and I have been around a long time and you think you kind of have this figured out, reevaluate and think about things. And this is a weekly process for me, by the way. One of the last things I do on Sunday morning is read through everything I've typed out and say, hey, is this okay? Do I need to change this? I mean, at 7:00 on Sunday morning, I get up at 5. By 7:00, I'm still questioning all those things to make sure we don't, in some way, have something damaging occur. And you just need to be vigilant in that area.
Right. There's a tremendous amount of power in speech, especially power that comes from an authoritative position. And so caution is always important. Demeanor and standard come into play, and then There's always the outlying troll who wants to try to pull things off to the side. It may not even pay attention to the entire conversation altogether, just bring some upside points, tries to make a point. Not
Robert
with much
Ogden
effort.
says to reevaluate that Tennessee hat, bro. I got to tell you, Robert, that Tennessee hat is autographed by Bill Dance. So there's a reason why that Tennessee hat's hanging back there on the old bookshelf, because it's the master fisherman, outside of Jesus, of course. Let's probably do that. But that's a Bill Dance autographed hat. We're never getting rid of that bad boy, because I grew up on Saturday morning and watched Bill Dance catch fish in Tennessee. So I just had to deal with that real quick.
Well, and to add some more balance, out of the last 5 weekends, I spent 4 of them in Tennessee. I love my Georgia brethren and my Georgia peeps, but there's some wonderful people in Tennessee too. So, Robert, you're outnumbered completely. Go find another place to be. Anyway,
I love me some Robert Ogden though.
Yeah. Yep.
Well, hey,
he's a Georgia resident now too. So,
Phil, you want to wrap us up?
Yeah, actually I do. A couple of things. One of the things I wanted to make sure we close out with as a reminder that if this is something you find valuable, like the page, share the page, do all the things they tell you to do. Terry and I really enjoy doing it. Even when we get frustrated about the process, we still enjoy the outcome. Beyond that, take a little time, especially those who preach, to be away from your preaching. Go find yourself a spot to be that the preaching doesn't impact your moment at that time. Read your Bible, in an unrelated text to your classes. Take your wife out to dinner, even if it's to, grab a picnic and go out in the park. Just spend some time actually building you. Something that takes place as preaching is that you pull on yourself the pain of everybody else around you. So you've got to have a way to release that stress in a healthy way before you explode. So go find that. Go find that opportunity. Also know this, a lot of your brethren are going to be sending their kids off to college soon. That's this time of the year. These seasonal changes come into play. Be compassionate to the moms. Be strong for the dads. And give everybody a hug.
Let me tell you what happens when your kid goes to college. There are always tears. Phil is going to be crying tears of sadness as they leave their son, and I, and probably my wife maybe, but I will definitely be crying tears of joy to have him gone once again. Difference is Jesse's a freshman for Phil. My son is a sophomore. It is completely different. So we'll ask everybody to pray for our kids' safety as they do make that travel, and that's for all, regardless of where they're going to school. It's a busy time of year for families like ours. So, Phil, thanks for joining me today and for the conversation. Enjoyed it. Look forward to next week.
Always good. Yep. Take care, everybody. Have a great day.
Bye-bye.